Rome didn't collapse in one dramatic moment, it bled. And by the middle of the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was bleeding in a way that felt permanent, like a wound that never fully closes. Provinces were still Roman on paper, but on the ground everything was harder to tax, harder to defend, harder to govern, harder to believe in. In that atmosphere, a single battlefield victory could mean more than territory. It could mean confidence. It could mean time. It could mean survival. That's why Strasbourg matters. Because Strasbourg was not simply a clash between Romans and barbarians. It was a test of whether the West could still do the one thing empires must do to remain empires: enforce consequences. If it failed, Gaul, one of the West's most valuable regions, could begin slipping from Rome's control not by a formal surrender, by slow dissolution. Towns would depopulate, roads would become unsafe, taxes would fail, recruitment would shrink, frontier defense would collapse into endless crisis. The West did not need a single enemy to end it. It only needed the frontier to become permanently unmanageable. In the years leading up to 357, the Rhine frontier had become a pressure point. For generations, Rome had treated the Rhine as a boundary it could defend through forts, patrols, river control, diplomacy, and periodic punishment campaigns. The system was never perfect, but it was predictable. Predictability is what empires convert into routine. Routine taxation, routine trade, routine recruitment, routine authority. Yet by the 350s, predictability was failing. Confederations of Germanic groups, especially the Alemanni in this region, crossed into Roman territory with rising confidence. Some came for loot, some came for land, some came because Rome looked weak, distracted, and divided. And that last reason mattered most. Rome's enemies were not only reacting to opportunity, they were reading Rome's internal condition. Civil wars and imperial rivalries drained attention from the frontier. Garrisons were stretched, local cities were exposed. Trade routes became dangerous, villages emptied. The psychological effect was brutal. Roman civilians and soldiers began to feel that protection was no longer guaranteed. This is what frontier collapse looks like before it becomes a map change, not a cinematic "Rome has fallen" moment. Just a slow erosion of safety. And safety is the foundation of loyalty. When people stop believing the state can protect them, the state becomes optional. When the state becomes optional, borders dissolve. So when Julian arrived in Gaul, he did not step into a stable command. He stepped into a region haunted by defeat and uncertainty. Morale was brittle. The frontier had become a place where bad news arrived faster than reinforcements, and Julian himself was not the obvious hero. He was young. He was appointed. He was tied to imperial politics. He had enemies who saw him as decorative and allies who hoped he could be useful. Yet he had been given a mission that would break most commanders, restore Roman control and credibility in Gaul. Restoring control does not start with one battle. It starts with belief. Julian needed civilians to believe Rome could still protect them. He needed soldiers to believe discipline still mattered. He needed frontier coalitions to believe crossing the Rhine was no longer free. That meant operations, not speeches. It meant marching when the enemy expected hesitation. Holding ground that everyone expected be abandoned. Choosing engagements that restored deterrence rather than feeding enemy advantage. By 357, the Alemanni had gathered a large force, confident enough to meet Rome in open battle. That confidence was itself a signal. It came from years of successful raids, weakened Roman responses, and the sense that the West was distracted by its own politics. In other words, the Alemanni were not only fighting Rome's army, they were testing Rome's reputation. Julian understood that, and reputation is why Strasbourg mattered. Strasbourg sat near key corridors and crossings where control was not simply about holding a town. It was about holding the ability to move troops, protect cities, and keep Gaul connected. If Rome lost the ability to operate freely here, Gaul would become contested territory. Always raided, always bleeding, always doubting. And an empire that cannot stabilize its core provinces begins dying from the inside. So Julian moved toward confrontation, not as a reckless charge, but as a decision to break the enemy's confidence in a single decisive moment. Rome did not need to kill every enemy warrior. Rome needed to prove that a frontier coalition could be beaten in the field. Because if a coalition can be beaten, it becomes cautious. Cautious enemies raid less and negotiate more. And negotiation is what gives empires breathing room. Breathing room was the currency the West desperately needed. But before the battle began, the tension in Julian's army would have been enormous. They were not marching toward a small skirmish. They were marching toward a test. Many soldiers would have been thinking a thought that can destroy discipline. If we lose this, Gaul is finished. That fear can either fracture an army or sharpen it, depending on leadership. Julian had to hold them together. He had to convince his men that Roman order was not a tradition. It was survival. He had to keep the battle inside a frame Rome could win: formation, timing, controlled pressure. Because Strasbourg would not be decided only by bravery. It would be decided by geometry, by flanks, spacing, cavalry movement, and whether either side lost shape under stress. Once shape is lost, panic spreads. And once panic spreads, even a large army can collapse quickly. In the next part, we step onto the battlefield itself, the opening shocks, the cavalry crisis points, the infantry grind, and the moments when victory was possible for either side. Because Strasbourg was not inevitable, Julian did not save Gaul by magic. He saved it by preventing the West's most dangerous enemy from winning that day: chaos. By the time Julian's army formed up near Strasbourg, the most dangerous thing wasn't the enemy's weapons. It was expectation. Roman soldiers expected hard fighting, but beneath that sat a deeper fear. The fear that Rome's best days were gone and this battle was simply another chapter in decline. That kind of fear kills armies quietly. It makes soldiers hesitate, makes units drift, makes commanders overact. Julian had to fight that fear first. Strasbourg was not a battle the West could afford to lose. Not because the empire would collapse the next morning, but because Gaul was the West's lifeline. It supplied tax, grain, and recruits. It formed strategic depth behind the Rhine. If Gaul became a permanent war zone, raided and psychologically shaken, the West would lose its ability to regenerate. The stakes were structural. The Alemanni had gathered a coalition force precisely because they sensed weakness. Their confidence wasn't accidental. It came from years of successful raids, fragmented Roman responses, and the sense that internal Roman politics had drained frontier defense. They came not just to fight, but to send a message. This border belongs to whoever is bold enough to take it. When the lines formed, it was a clash of styles. The Roman army's advantage was still discipline, training, layered command, and the habit of holding formation under pressure. The Alemanni fought with heavy infantry mass and aggressive momentum. They expected Rome to waver. They expected Roman units to break as others had broken before. So Strasbourg becomes a test of one question: can Roman structure still absorb tribal momentum? Julian needed the battle to remain a battle of formations, not a brawl. The most common way an army dies is not instant annihilation, but small ruptures, one unit stepping back, another stepping sideways, cavalry chasing too far, gaps opening. Once gaps appear, the line stops protecting itself. Once the line stops protecting itself, fear spreads. And fear is contagious. The opening phase tested the edges. Cavalry clashes first because cavalry creates chaos faster than infantry. When cavalry wins a flank, it can wrap behind the enemy, threaten the rear, and turn a steady front into a trap. Late Roman cavalry could be unstable. Horses panic, units scatter. Morale shifts instantly. If Roman cavalry failed early, Julian's infantry would be exposed and confidence could collapse. That is what made the cavalry struggle so dangerous. Julian could not personally fight every flank. His job was to impose discipline, keep units from chasing, keep the line's shape intact, and prevent one local setback from becoming an army-wide panic. As cavalry fought, infantry closed. The Alemanni charge hit like physics, weight against weight, momentum against structure. If the Roman line folded, it would not fold politely, it would collapse. Roman discipline mattered in tiny actions, a man leaning into his shield instead of stepping back, an officer shouting timing rather than rage, units maintaining spacing rather than clumping, soldiers resisting the instinct to break formation and chase an early target. The longer the Roman line held, the more the Alemanni paid a hidden cost: fatigue. Momentum burns energy. Charges feel powerful, but if they don't break the enemy quickly, they become expensive. When the charge loses speed, the battle becomes a grinding push, and grinding favors the side with superior discipline and command. Strasbourg began to tilt gradually, like a door being pushed closed. But victory brings its own danger over confidence. The temptation to chase too early can break the winner's formation and allow a desperate counterstrike. Julian needed controlled victory, not a reckless pursuit that would leave his army exhausted and vulnerable. The point was to win in a way that changed the enemy's behavior afterward. Once the battle dragged into a long, grinding contest, Strasbourg stopped being about who could charge harder. It became about who could stay coherent longer. Coherence is where Rome, when it remembers how to be Rome, still has power. The empire in decline wasn't powerless, it was uneven. Strasbourg mattered because it showed that under the right leadership, Rome could concentrate its strengths into something decisive. The Roman line held longer than the Alemanni expected. That alone was a shock. Attackers rely on a psychological chain. The charge hits, the enemy hesitates, the line wobbles, and the wobble spreads. But when the enemy does not wobble, the charge stops feeling heroic and starts feeling costly. Fatigue rises, confidence drains. The coalition begins to question whether its momentum will actually deliver victory. At this stage, the battlefield's geometry decides the outcome. If either side's flanks turn, the center suddenly feels exposed. Soldiers can tolerate pressure in front. They cannot tolerate the sense that pressure is coming from the side or behind. That perception creates panic faster than any spear. As the fight continued, Roman units stabilized and applied pressure methodically. The Alemanni, who came to overwhelm quickly, were forced into a long fight that punished endurance. Large coalitions depend on leadership confidence. When chiefs appear in control, warriors fight longer. When leadership is lost, fear spreads faster than commands. A turning point comes as enemy leadership collapses or is neutralized on the field. Sources vary in detail, but the dynamic is consistent. Leadership disruption weakens cohesion. Cohesion doesn't fail as one dramatic break. It fails as small exits. A cluster of men pulls back, a gap opens. Neighboring men step sideways to fill it. They become thinner. Another gap opens. Soon the line becomes a chain with broken links. This is where Roman discipline becomes lethal. A disciplined army waits for structural weakness. It does not need to win every push. It needs one opening. When the opening appears, it expands it systematically. The Romans press gaps, widen them, punish attempts to reorganize, and keep the enemy from reforming a stable line. The Alemanni are pushed into partial retreat, the most dangerous battlefield state. Some units withdraw while others still fight. Signals become unclear. Fear and bravery collide. Soldiers look sideways and ask the question that decides everything. Are we still holding? Once enough men decide the answer is no, retreat becomes flight. Flight is where casualties rise because formation disappears. Shields drop. Spacing breaks. People run into each other. The battle becomes a chase. Yet Julian's restraint matters again. Uncontrolled pursuit can reverse victory by breaking the winner's formation, exhausting troops, and exposing them to surprise counterattacks. Julian needed a victory that could be enforced afterward. He needed deterrence, not a one-day frenzy. When Rome wins, the real outcome is not just the enemy's retreat. It is the change in frontier behavior. Strasbourg sends a message across the Rhine. Rome can still assemble, march, and win. That changes calculations. It matters to civilians deciding whether to flee. It matters to elites deciding whether to cooperate with taxation. It matters to soldiers deciding whether service still has meaning. It matters to other groups watching and waiting. Strasbourg did not solve the West's problems. It did not end raiding forever. It did not fix internal Roman politics. But it stopped the bleeding. It bought time, and in a fragile system. Buying time is survival. After Strasbourg, the most important thing on the field wasn't the broken weapons. It was the fact that Gaul still felt Roman. Empires don't only control land with armies, they control land with expectation. Expectation that the state will return, punish, protect, and enforce laws. Once that expectation disappears, the empire becomes optional. When the empire becomes optional, borders dissolve. Strasbourg slowed that dissolution. Not forever, but long enough to matter. Roman civilians in Gaul had been living under rising fear that the Rhine was no longer a boundary, but an invitation. Raids were not only material loss, they were proof that Roman response was inconsistent. Inconsistency kills loyalty. Julian's victory restored the idea that Rome could still deliver consequences. Once consequences return, behavior changes. Frontier coalitions reassess risk. Some retreat, some negotiate, some become cautious. The frontier becomes contested again rather than a one-way pressure system. That is what buying time looks like. Time means harvests without constant disruption. Roads reopen. Towns repair walls without believing it's pointless. Taxes collect more reliably. Recruitment becomes possible again. Time is the resource the West needed most. Strasbourg also changed Julian. Before the battle, Julian was an appointment, young and underestimated. After Strasbourg, he became a commander with credibility. In late Roman politics, credibility becomes power because victory creates loyalty and loyalty creates leverage. Yet the deeper truth is this: Strasbourg did not prevent the West's eventual collapse. The Western Empire will still face enormous pressures in the coming decades. It will still suffer from internal instability and external challenges, and it will eventually fall in the 5th century. So, why say Julian saved the Western Empire? Because history is not only about final outcomes, it is about moments when outcomes could have accelerated. If Strasbourg goes the other way, Gaul could have become shattered far earlier. Roman authority could have retreated south. The Rhine line could have become meaningless. The West would have lost one of its most important provinces at the worst possible moment, with cascading consequences for manpower, revenue, and legitimacy. Strasbourg prevented that acceleration. It held the line long enough for the West to keep functioning. And that is the final lesson. The West's survival in the 4th century was not a myth. It was conditional. It depended on leadership, discipline, and the ability to restore deterrence at key moments. Julian's victory at Strasbourg was one of those moments. It wasn't a magical rescue. It was controlled order defeating chaos. It was a wounded empire proving, briefly, powerfully, that it could still defend itself through skill rather than luck. Julian didn't stop time forever, but at Strasbourg, he bent it back in Rome's favor. And the West lived longer because he did.